صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I begin in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praise belongs to Him. The one who creates, but is not created. The one who sees, but is unseen. And the one who gave us the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam as the best example for us to follow. And coincidentally today, it is his message that we are remembering and his legacy that we are looking to aspire to. The Prophet Muhammad has been referred to as a mercy to mankind, as the best in creation. Indeed, one of the reasons for him being sent was to correct the character flaws that exist among us as humans, to perfect our character. And one of the meanings behind this is that he ideally should be the ultimate role model. You know, we look at what's going on in today's society. You know, it's particularly, I bring attention to what happened in France a couple of days ago, that very tragic incident. And unfortunately, many misinformed individuals have attributed this to the religion of Islam, to the Prophet Muhammad. So ultimately, when a group of people are blaming the actions of Islam, ultimately they're blaming the Prophet Muhammad as the person who brought about a very violent, misogynist type ideology and religion. So, however, we reject this. And it only requires a brief examination of the life of the Prophet to show that these are complete fallacies. Now, what do I mean? We look at a very, very simple example during the lifetime of the Prophet, where one time he would have a daily routine where he would walk. And when he would walk, one of his neighbors, who was antagonistic towards him, would leave garbage in his path. And this would be a daily thing. The Prophet would come out of his home, he would see this garbage, and he would go on his way, wouldn't think much of it. The next day, the Prophet would come, he would see the garbage again, and then he would be on his way. Then, the following day came where the Prophet did not see garbage. And so then the Prophet thought to himself, there's some garbage here today. What could this mean? So upon further inquiry, he found out that the person who was leaving his garbage to annoy the Prophet was sick. So most of us, if we would hear something like this, we'd be like, yay, good riddance, thank God, I hope this person dies. But this wasn't the character of a prophet. What did he do? Instead, after inquiring about this person's well-being, he went to the house of this person, the neighbor who was sick. When this person saw who had come to visit him or her, the person was initially afraid that, oh no, Muhammad has come to take revenge on me. And the Prophet said, no, let me explain why I'm here. I notice every day you have this daily routine of leaving garbage outside my place. So one day, I noticed the garbage wasn't there, so I was kind of curious. So upon further inquiry, I found out you were sick, so I came to check up on your well-being. This lady, when she heard this news, was so touched by his character that she said, I bear witness that there are no gods but one God, and that you, Muhammad, are the messenger of God. Sallallahu Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And then we have an even more powerful example of how the Prophet was very forgiving. Many of these people who attack the Prophet Islam, they forget that when the Prophet overcame Mecca, who was the biggest enemy of the Prophet? It was Abu Sufyan. So normally a person would think, okay, it's revenge time. Now it's time for justice. Now the Prophet is here to settle the score. What happened instead? Did the Prophet settle the score with Abu Sufyan, with Hind, Wahshi, all these people who for years and years tortured the Prophet, who tortured him, who tortured his companions, who tortured the family of the Prophet? Did the Prophet settle any scores? No. Instead, he said this was a day of forgiveness. And he granted amnesty to these individuals who had tortured him and his followers. So for us, this is a lesson. A lesson that no matter who does what to us, we should maintain and do our best to be patient under certain under certain circumstances, and that regardless of how evil a person was, we may in time forgive him. This is not to praise, just so that there's no misconceptions, this is not to praise Abu Sufyan or Hind or these individuals. Allah knows how to deal with them in the hereafter. But just to make a point that the Prophet had the opportunity to take revenge, and he would have been justified in doing this. But he did not. Instead, he granted them amnesty. Sallallahu Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So as we're discussing this concept of what it means to be a role model, because for us, the Prophet Muhammad is the ultimate role model. What does it mean to be a role model? Somebody we gain inspiration from. Somebody whose life lessons we take a lesson from. Somebody whose examples we follow. This is what it means to be a role model or to follow a role model. How many of us can honestly say that we've studied the life history, the life example of the Prophet, and see how he dealt with certain situations, how he dealt with problems, etc. I mean, often many of us, it's a shame, when we think of role models, we think of pop stars, we think of athletes, we think of musicians. We study their statistics very carefully, like how many touchdowns did this quarterback throw, how many three-point shots did this point guard make, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a problem to make individuals like this our ultimate role model. That doesn't mean we can't learn from these individuals, but making somebody your ultimate role model is something else. I mean, an example of a good role model would be parents who took care of you. It's normal for individuals to say, I look up to my parents as genuine role models because they took care of me, they worked hard. So that, so generally that's seen as a good thing and as an example of taking a role model. However, for us, the best example, undoubtedly, is the Prophet Muhammad as a role model. I'm sure, and after you give me a salawat, we'll discuss this in great detail. Salawat Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So how exactly do we derive inspiration from the Prophet, or from people in general? So we look at how they handled trials and challenges, how they handled different situations. So let's start with one. When we're ignored by people, it's natural for us to, and I speak first and foremost to myself. So when I give this advice, I'm not making the claim that I followed all these. All this advice is for myself first and foremost, and to all of us collectively. So when we've been shunned by people, by family, by friends, what do we do? I mean, a lot of times we throw ourselves a little pity party, we get very upset. Which is quite natural. But how did the Prophet handle this? We gave the example of the Prophet throwing garbage at him. People did other things to him and his family and his companions. And in fact, there's a narration that states that Jibreel and other angels came to the Prophet and said, "O Messenger of God, just say the word and we will punish these people." But no, the Prophet said no. The Prophet, declined the offer that the angel gave to punish these individuals who were oppressing the Prophet. You see initially the years of Mecca. You see then that they were moved to the valley of Abu Talib. After all this was done, ultimately the Prophet did a hijrah to Medina. So the lesson that we can learn is when we're facing challenges, particularly people mistreating us, individuals mistreating us, sometimes we need to do a hijrah like the Prophet did to Medina. It can be a hijrah in thinking. It can be a hijrah physically. So these are some points to reflect on. Sallallahu Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. How about the issues of engaging in dialogue with people? A lot of times among friends, families, other individuals, we get very passionate about what we believe in or what we disagree with. And so sometimes it turns into a shouting match, like, you're wrong, I'm right, you're this and this, you're a Bakri, Rafda, whatever the terms might be when we disagree with other individuals, etc. Was this the way of the Prophet? Was this how he gave nasiha? One time, a young man came up to the Prophet. And so this man goes to the Prophet and says, "Messenger of God, I'd like to do adultery. I'd like to be able to do zina freely and do adultery." The companions of the Prophet were like, how audacious is this guy? Let's pounce on him. So the Prophet was restrained. That'd probably be our reaction too if somebody said something as audacious as that. So the prophet engaged him in a dialogue. The first thing the prophet asked him was, do you have a mother? The man said, yes, I have a mother. He says, do you have a sister? The man says, yes, I have a sister. He said, how would you like it if somebody committed adultery with your mother? Would that work for you? The man said, no. He said, okay. What about if somebody committed adultery with your sister? Would that be acceptable to you? The man said, no. So then the prophet finally asked, how is it that what is unacceptable for your mother and sister is acceptable for you to do, who is potentially the mother and sister of another person? So the man realized his mistake and said, yes, you're right. So a lot of times we have to engage in dialogue with people. Questions, ask questions. Don't shove your opinions down people's throats. Don't be belligerent, but engage in questions, engage in dialogue, as our noble prophet did. The prophet was also very considerate of other people's feelings. A lot of times we have this notion that we want to tell it like it is. We want to give the blunt truth without any kind of consideration of how people feel. This is not the way of the prophet. Yes, the prophet was straightforward and concise, but he was always respectful of people's feelings. One time, a poor farmer came to the prophet, bringing a small piece of fruit. So he gave this piece of fruit to the prophet. The prophet started, thanked him for this fruit, and he started eating it in front of this man. And after a little while, the man left. So the prophet continuously was eating it, and he finished it. After he finished his fruit, this man, the companions of the prophet who were around him said, "O messenger of God, why did you pass the fruit to us?" Because usually the prophet would have, whenever he would receive something, he would distribute it among his companions who were sitting amongst him. So the prophet responded and said, "The reason I did not distribute this to you is the fruit that was brought to me was very sour. If I had given it to some of you would have been very, would have said, 'Oh wow, this is so sour, I can't eat this,' and you would have hurt the feelings of that man. So I did not want to hurt the feelings of the man, so I ate the fruit myself." So this is an example of akhlaq from our messenger. And earlier, we gave examples of the amnesty of the prophet, how he dealt with those who oppressed him. Now let us make it a point in our life to follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad. When we say the Prophet Muhammad, we know the famous tradition by the Prophet. The first of us is Muhammad. The middle of us is Muhammad, and the end of us is Muhammad. This is the famous tradition of the Prophet. So what are we talking about here? When we want to follow the Prophet, we follow his traditions as maintained by the family of the Prophet. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Last 2 points I'd like to make before I conclude very briefly is one of the other areas of inspiration that we get from the Prophet is how he dealt with issues such as racism. Racism, like today, was quite prevalent back then. So one of the things the Prophet did in showing this message that racism was unacceptable in Islam was he appointed Bilal as the first muezzin. And many people may not be aware of this, but Bilal had difficulty in pronouncing certain letters, pronouncing the letter Sheen in Arabic, because some say he had a burnt tongue, or whatever the reason is. So some of the companions complained to the Prophet. When he gave the adhan, he would pronounce it the way he was pronouncing it. And so some of the companions complained and said, "Why are you letting this person give the adhan?" They already had this ingrained racism. But the Prophet said, "His incorrect pronunciation of adhan is sweeter to my ears than your correct pronunciation of the adhan." Meaning that Bilal had a sincerity that the other people lacked. And then of course we know the famous story of the Prophet where there was a person who was considered black at that time, who was very poor and so forth. And this man wanted to get married. So the Prophet said, "I'll marry you. I'll find you a wife of the best of tribes." One of the elite, one of the aristocrats at that time, who happened to be Muslim. So initially, this aristocratic family put up opposition to this. And then the Prophet responded to them and said, I did away with this kind of, racism that, we only marry certain families, things like that. This is the example of the Prophet. are we following his example this day, or are we simply giving lip service to the Prophet? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. And finally, the last point that I'd like to share with you in terms of deriving inspiration from the Prophet is his concept of shura. Now, what's interesting about the concept of shura is, did the Prophet need to consult anybody? Was he required to do this? The answer is no. He had complete authority from Allah. But this is an example to us that when we want to take important decisions, when we want to embark on important tasks, that we consult those who are wise and have wisdom. You know, there was a famous battle of Khandaq, where in the battle of Khandaq, the Muslims were outnumbered, the Quraysh were closing in on them. So the Prophet, decided to see what other people would say. So one of the companions of the Prophet, Salman al-Farsi, suggested that they build a trench around where they were. And this proved to be a very effective technique. And later on, we know the story of Imam Ali beating one of the heroes of the Quraysh. And then a wind came, and then that battle was lost. This battle of Khandaq. So keep in mind, when you make an important decision, consult others. Don't try to be, one-man show, one-woman show. Learn from those who have wisdom and experience, and consult their advice. Something to keep in mind. So in conclusion, I'd like to ask all of you to raise your hands in dua. Oh, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allah, please forgive us for all of our sins, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, those of us who are suffering from financial difficulties, please grant us rizq, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, many of us are suffering in this world. Political oppression, economic oppression. People around the world are suffering at the hands of takfiris and those who are destroying the true message of Islam. Ya Allah, please remove their sufferings, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, when Imam Mahdi comes, let us be of those who are with him and not those who are against him. Sallallahu Muhammad wa